other people. Okay, so tonight what we're going to do is we're going to briefly introduce the importance of fossil finance campaigning in the movement, and tell you a little bit more about the Defund Climate Coalition. What is it for? What do we do? What it has achieved so far? We're going to explore the links between fossil finance campaigning and the cost of living crisis, so you can take that back to your trade unions. Hopefully, we'll have a little bit of a breakout discussion in smaller groups as well, so everybody get time to, if there's things you haven't understood, or to have like a conversation in smaller groups. And we will then give some feedback and share some of the next step we can take in this campaign. I'm just wondering if anybody here has participated in any divestment campaigns before, pension divestments at all, or have you taken part into protests against banks and insurances? And if you like to share that with the group briefly, we've got time to do so. Anybody? So I've got Robin, and I think Emmett has just joined us as well. Welcome, Emmett. We just introduced ourselves, so you may want to share in the chat, which trade union you're from, where you're based in the UK, and any campaigning you've done. But Robin, you've taken action against banks. Do you want to tell us briefly what you did in a couple of sentences?
Well, here's the thing. It wasn't with the trade union. It was just with Extinction Rebellion back in February, March. So we did a street performance outside the banks, and I brought along a few. It was just talking about how bad Barclays is, but it was also I brought a few newspaper magazines with me as well, with all of the stats regarding fossil finance. So then I've also done one with Coventry Climate Action Network, which was probably it wasn't as interesting, it wasn't as fun, but it was a little bit more comprehensive because it covered all the banks.
Excellent. Thanks, Robin, for sharing that. And to be honest, there haven't been, to my knowledge, any trade union actions on fossil finance. So, I didn't expect that to be shared today. If you've got any links that you'd like to share and we can circulate them afterward, please feel free to add in the chat. Anybody else have done some campaigning against banks or on pension divestments at all? I can't see anybody else. So, Kathleen.
I was going to ask Emmett. I took part in the Barclays protest, but I know that Emmett really prepared a lot of statistics and visuals and things like that. So apologies if I put you on the spot, Emmett, but I just think all the work you did would be worth talking about.
Hi everybody, sorry, no, I just had to mute and turn off the camera because I was just done my dinner. But no, yeah, that was, I think, part of the Barclays campaign, basically, on how they greenwashed all their policies, and they've been Europe's #1 funder of the fossil fuel industry and funding things like Drax as well. And so yeah, we had I can't remember when it was, actually it was over a month ago anyway, just a protest outside the front of it, but the front of the branch in Belfast, but got some really good engagement from the public. And yeah, so it went pretty well. It was relatively small, but still quite effective. So I don't know if there's anything else you'll know or.
No, thank you. That's great. Right. Like sharing a few bits, but if you've got any links you want to share, feel free to add in the chat. And yeah, I just want to welcome Lucy as well. We just started and we introduced ourselves. So if you didn't get a chance to introduce yourself, if you want to share, your names, pronouns, where you're based in the country, what trade union you belong, and any other climate groups you may be part of. But we're now going to go into the sort of introduction about what is fossil finance. So I'm going to start the presentation and share my screen if that's okay with everybody. So let me do that. Share screen. Okay, and then a slideshow. Can everybody see my screen? Is that all right? Give me a thumb up. Maybe Kathleen, if you can, because I can't see everybody. Brilliant. Okay, so yeah, this is a trade union briefing from the Defund Climate Chaos Coalition. And what we're going to do today is look at what the fossil fuel industry actually is. We're going to look at the pillar of support, what keeps it going, and how the different institutions in the fossil fuel finance system are connected. We'll explore briefly, what is it we can demand, and something that we've learned through the campaigning. Briefly look at trade union and fossil finance, which there is not much going at the moment, apart from the pension divestments. And also briefly look at the Defund Climate Coalition and what is it we do. Once I finish this presentation, my colleague Al is gonna briefly talk you through the links between fossil finance campaigning and the cost of living crisis. So there's gonna be a bit of talking by us first, but then the rest of the event is more participatory. So bear with us. So, why do we focus on fossil fuel? I think many of you will already know that, but we know that there is many reasons for climate change. They are very complex, and there are also other ecological crises. But fossil fuels are present in every sort of level of production, extractions, transport. So, on this little graphic, you can visually see that fossil fuels are going to be involved into power generation. It's going to be involved into food production. It's going to be involved into industry, involved into extraction of all, minerals and other fossil fuels, but also in transports. There are many other sectors that involve fossil fuels, but these are like the main ones. But in total, if we calculate across all the sectors, without separating them, the fossil fuel industry is responsible for more than 80% of global CO2 emissions. And that's why it's so important that we focus on those companies and those issues. But what actually is the fossil fuel industry? Often we're gonna, look at those oil and gas platform in the North Sea, or we're gonna look at some oil fields in the Middle East, or drilling in the Arctic, or maybe it's coal mining in Germany. And actually, we rarely think about the financial institutions that are behind those fossil fuel companies. And that can be banks, but also insurance companies. And it is the same people who are impacted by the fossil fuel companies and by those banks, often in countries that are located in the global south, people and communities that did least to create the climate crisis, but who are also on the front line of its effects, whether they are in Africa, Asia, Latin America, but also the poorest communities in the global north. So it's the same people who are impacted by the climate crisis who did least to cause it. The decisions are made by those big financiers and the fossil fuel companies, whether they are in New York, London, or Frankfurt. Okay, so how do we find them? And we need to think about power when we do that. So traditionally, on the left-hand side, we think about power like a pyramid. It flows down. This is the traditional view of power. But actually, if you turn that pyramid upside down, you can actually realize how unstable it is. There are several pillars of support that allow that power to be perpetrated and reproduced. And if we target those pillars, the whole thing could come crashing down. So oil, gas, and coal companies, they can't survive on their own. They're held up by pillars of support. And pillars of support can be things like the permissions granted by governments, accessing lobbyists to pressure politicians and influence public opinion, but also a big one, money. So we need to follow the money. to understand how to get that fossil fuel power crashing. This is an example that was put together by some comrades in Germany in the Sunrise project. And actually, most of the content of this presentation was put together by an amazing campaigner called Tony Norshin, who is based in Germany. So they've done that, little overview of just one bank, Deutsche Bank. And you can see that, they've been given 50 million pounds to Ineos and Europa Oil and Gas, which are the UK frackers that we may see coming back very soon, because we're expecting fracking to be restarted in the country. Deutsche Bank gave over $12 billion for Shell and ExxonMobil, who are involved in some gas fields in Germany. They gave 250 million pounds to companies now involved in the Midcat gas pipeline. There were $917 million to a company, RWE, who is involved in coal fields in the Rhineland region. And the list go on, whether it's German companies, or we've got BP here on the list as well, American companies. Just one bank is supporting so many of those fossil fuel companies. So, we'll be working on identifying further what other banks are doing, and certainly looking at giving more a UK example, but I think this is quite astonishing to see that. The real scale of big finance support for climate chaos is mind-blowing. We're talking about $3.8 trillion in total. And this is not just through donated body or lending money. There is a whole range of ways this financial support are channeled to those fossil fuel companies. It can be loans. It can be via insurances or underwriting. It can be through buying bonds and shares. But also we've got those, middlemen who are like brokers. They can decide to invest on behalf of customers. They've got voting powers on the fossil fuel companies. And there is a huge amount of centralized power that's concentrated in their hands. So it's quite a complex system with lots of different pillars that we need to look at to understand this fossil finance system. And they are all links, because the loans can go to shareholders, they can go to those brokers, they can go to the insurances, and they're all feeding each other basically. So without the support of banks, investors and insurers, new fossil fuel projects can't go ahead. And that's why it's so important to work on forcing financial institutions to withdraw support for specific projects, because it can increase delays and give us a better chance of getting the project cancelled. For example, the EACOP pipeline, so the East Africa crude oil pipeline, has been delayed so far by 5 years by the campaign, which is excellent. And when we are able to do so, we are exposing the greenwash of those financial institutions, and we can tell stories of people power. But firefighting on a project by project, is just one aspect. It is a duty, and it's necessary for activists in the global north, because we've got quite a lot of resources and a lot of time and a lot of people who are able to campaign more publicly. We can't resist every new fossil fuel project, because there are thousands of them. So ultimately, we need to democratize and regulate the finance sector to make support for new fossil fuel impossible. And that's within the power of finance ministries, central banks, regulator. But that's ultimately where we need change. So what can we demand, really? Yes, we can demand don't found this coal mine, and that's an important part of the campaigning. But then we also should demand don't fund any coal. And that's also applying to oil and gas, obviously. So we want to ask, don't fund any fossil fuels. But that's not just enough to say, well, we are against. We also want to demand to provide alternatives, demand climate jobs, and demand a just transition for workers who are already in those fossil fuel industries. They shouldn't be paying the price for a transition to a more sustainable economy. But we need to remember the role of money and debt as power, and it controls and drives fossil fuel and resources extraction at the cost of people in the global south in particular, while it is people in the global north who benefits. So systemic changes are the only long-term solution. It's up to us to bring this institution under control and force those with power to do their jobs. The trade union movement has done very little campaigning around those financial institutions when it comes to funding fossil fuels. The main aspect has been through the pensions divestment campaign. We know that local authority pension funds in particular in the UK are funneling a huge amount of money into fossil fuel projects. It's not just local authorities, by the way. There's also the university pension funds, but unions like Unison and UCU, who represent workers in local authority pension funds and university pension funds, have been the most vocal on campaigning on those pension divestments. But in the UK, we are talking about over 300 billion pounds in those pension funds, and just under 10 billion is actually invested into fossil fuel. So that's about 3%. So that's really important aspect of fossil fuel campaigning, but not just, as we've just said, the system is much wider and much more complex. So there is other pressure we can put. So just a few tips. If you are keen to campaign on fossil finance, you don't need to be an expert. You don't need to know everything about finances to campaign on finance. You know, this is about ordinary people like you and me being able to have our say. Money is something that people still understand to some basic extent. So most people will understand what is fair and what is not. People will understand taxes, they understand power that comes with money. So it's something that we can talk to working class people about. People do care about people. So if we tell story of how people are being affected by those investments in fossil fuel projects, then people will pay more attention. We also know that people in the finance industry are afraid of people outside it. They don't want us to campaign on it. They don't want us to understand it. They don't want to be called out. So let's get out there and give them a bit of a fright. We will power through solidarity, and that's something that's very important for the trade union movement and in the climate justice movement. We need to show solidarity with people and communities in the global south, with workers in the different industries, with the poorest communities affected across the world. And the last tip is, let's be creative, because campaigning against climate change can be really sometimes exhausting, frightening, and disempowering. But when we use creativity, it is like a way of bringing a bit of fun and reaching out to people in different ways rather than just talking about it in a very serious way. Right. So that's a little bit of a outline of what fossil finance campaigning is about, and I'll briefly tell you a little bit more about Defund Climate Chaos. It's a coalition of groups in the UK that is about a year and a half old. It came together in the last few months before COP26 in Glasgow, because so many different groups were actually targeting financial institutions as part of their climate campaigning, that everybody thought we needed to have a bit more coordination, do joint action, share resources. So here are some of the groups that are part of it. Some people have mentioned Extinction Rebellion. Well, Money Rebellion, Insurance Rebellion, that are subgroups, are part of it, but also Call Action Network, Students for Global Health. bigger NGOs like Friend of the Earth, War on Want, 350, but also the Friday for Future MAPA, which are the most affected people and areas. Young people in the Global South have been campaigning with us, the Pacific Climate Warriors, and others, including more recently, Eastbourne Trade Union Council has passed the motion and joined the coalition. So it's a growing coalition, and we hope that your groups can sign up to a coalition, but also your trade union branches or your trade councils. Ideally, we'd like national unions to join, but that's work in the making. The coalition has been focusing around 6 demands. First one is keep it in the ground. Achieving climate justice, as we know, it means keeping fossil fuels in the ground if we want to keep below the 1.5 degrees increase and prevent irreparable social and ecological collapse. So we must prevent future fossil fuel extraction before we even reduce the existing production. So let's stop further expansion. No more coal, oil, gas, fracking, or biomass projects. The second demand is stop funding climate chaos, as we've just discussed. We are saying that financial institutions must stop financing and insuring new fossil fuel extraction and carbon intensive projects. So that will also be valid for airport, massive road projects, etc. We want fossil-free money. So public money must be divested out of polluting industries by central banks, pension funds, government subsidies. That's money that we should instead reinvest in community-devised and owned solutions. We demand that polluters pay. So people worldwide are already facing major loss and damage due to climate chaos. So polluters, financial institutions, and those who profit from them must pay climate reparation for the harms they are driving globally. We are asking to fund a global Green New Deal. This is about a rapid transition to a more just world, and that will require huge investments. So working people should not foot this bill, especially those hardest hit by climate disaster. So it's time to properly tax rich individuals and giant corporations. This means implementing loophole, free progressive taxation, and financial transaction tax, and also for public institutions to use all the tools at their disposal to fund the green transition. Finally, we say people, not profits. So together, through public ownership, direct democracy, we need to transform our energy and financial sector to build a system that works for everyone and ensure green low-cost energy access for all. That are the demands that you can also find on our website, so please do share them around. And since launching last year, the Defund Climate Coalition has engaged in major mobilization targeting the finance sector. Some of you have already mentioned them, but on the eve of the COP26 in 2021, people across the globe took the fight to the doors of major banks, investors, and insurers. So for example, here you can see an action in London at the headquarters of Standard Chartered, with a lot of young people from Friday for Future groups across the globe that came together to organize these protests. We also had action against Lloyds Bank, using a fake pipeline to demand for them to stop insuring. We organized some climate justice vigil as well, with candles and speakers and moments of silence and remembrance. A number of groups are also organizing smaller actions. This is all the Barclays action that many XR groups are involved with. So it doesn't take much to bring, a small group of people with some banners that you can make yourself and have events at your local Barclays branch. But also in particular projects. So this is about the Silvertown Tunnel in London. Each big project, infrastructure project, have got the backing of banks and insurers. So this was an example of a vigil that was organized there. There were also action at banks' AGMs in April. Some of you have said they participated. And again, like different creative action, disturbing the shareholder AGMs, standing up and, you know, making speeches about why we need to defund climate chaos. The last image I'll share with you is unfortunately not in the UK, but this is a street mural that was created in San Francisco during COP26. And that's something we're looking at developing in this country as well. Really like visual, and that brought like different communities and artists to create a very impactful and visual message across the world. Okay, that's all from me now, and sorry for speaking too much, but I'm now going to pass on to Al for a moment to say, what has it got to do with the cost of living crisis? I'm sure you're starting to figure it out, the links between those institutions and the cost of living crisis. But Al, if you don't mind sharing some of your thoughts with the group before we discuss that further.
Yeah, of course. I just want to come back to this comment in the chat that Ken's posted here around insurance arrangements for fossil fuel extraction being a big issue. I feel like within fossil finance, we put a huge amount of our energy into banks and also divestment. And I'm glad that you've raised insurance, because we know that when we're dealing with fossil finance, it is not just banks that are responsible for that. It is also a whole host of insurers and also investors behind that, which is why it makes it so hard, because for any project you can have, you know, 200, 300 different insurers, investors and banks all behind that one project. So it's really difficult. But yeah, as I say, banks are just one of the three kind of areas that we target. The other two being investors and insurers. And then divestment, again, we talk about it a lot and it has been very successful. But I think in the last few years, we've seen that kind of calm down a little bit from when it first exploded. And divestment, again, is just one of many, many tools that we have when it comes to fossil finance. I'm getting to the cost of living, but I think for me, the thing that drew me so much to fossil finance was understanding that from like a global north perspective, when you live in the UK, you are in such close proximity to these banks, these investors and these insurers that we don't have an excuse not to act. You know, that's the best form of solidarity that we can enact. But I think more and more in recent years, it's become really apparent to me that when we're talking about fossil finance and the injustices that play out, climate change is affecting working class communities within the UK today. It is unevenly distributed, it is. And also with the cost of living, these things have kind of become even more apparent as to why it's not just an issue of international solidarity, but also domestic solidarity. So hopefully I can I'll be very quick, but just kind of flesh out some of these arguments. So I wish at the moment we didn't have an opportunity to kind of make fossil finance so apparent. The cost of living crisis is something we're all aware of. It's something that lots of us will be feeling. I don't in any way want to sound too flippant when I say that it's an opportunity. It's also a real disaster and it's terrifying. But I think when it comes to kind of bringing in an understanding of climate justice into our work at the moment, trade unions within the UK are really having to stand up every day to defend members and make all of the links really clear, you know, between capitalism and the exploitation of people. And we've got a really unique opportunity right now to make more of those links, as I'm sure that many of you are. So hopefully a bit of this will be helpful. I'm also happy to send this out afterwards. So we know at the moment, millions of people in the UK are struggling to afford food and also energy. And that is happening at the same time as fossil fuel corporations like BP, like Shell, they are recording the biggest ever profit margins that we've ever seen. That's criminal. It's absolutely criminal. And those companies like Shell and BP, they are only able to operate because they have behind them banks, insurers, and investors to help them put the money into those fossil fuel projects, usually outside of Europe, as Clara was saying, with the East Africa crude oil pipeline. That's all money that's come in from North America and Europe. So obviously within the UK, lots of people struggling to afford to eat. These companies announcing record profit margins. And the cost of living crisis we're seeing already play out. It is working people within the UK and within other countries in Europe that are footing the bill for that. And without that direct financial backing from those UK investors, without loans from the UK's largest banks, fossil fuel corporations would fall flat, and that would be profit that would be put back into our economy in other ways. Again, I'm sure that this isn't a surprise to any of you. You're all very aware of this, but our current economic system functions to ensure that corporations, banks, all of these economic institutions profit from crisis. And that's not just the climate crisis, it's the cost of living crisis. I think when we talk about crises, we often fail to make the link between them. The cost of living crisis and the climate crisis are symptoms of exactly the same problem and exactly the same systems, both within the UK and also internationally. Yeah, our economic system is designed by and for the wealthy elite at the expense, again, of working people. Profits at the top are made at the expense of the rest of us, and they depend on the exploitation of people and planet by banks, by investors, by insurers globally and within the UK. Yeah, and today that system is continuing to push millions more of us into poverty, which, as I said, is criminal. So before the cost of living crisis started, millions of people in the UK were already struggling to make ends meet. And this has been caused, again, I'm sure that you're all very aware of this, but it's been caused by decades of government neglect, cuts to our communities, ruthless exploitation by companies, by banks, by insurers, by investors, fuel poverty, as well as like poor home insulation, higher rates of disability, greater reliance on public transport, and denser inner city crowding. They're just some of the reasons why working class communities within the UK are more affected by the climate crisis. So I'm trying to make this link here that as banks and investors and insurers within the UK pour more money into climate chaos, it's going to make things even worse on a domestic level as well. I hope you're all following that. What else have I got here? Yeah, kind of events like this current cost of living crisis, I think as climate change progresses, are going to become the new normal in all of our lives. And again, those effects are going to be disproportionately felt both within the UK and internationally. We already see that. And I hope that I'm making that point quite clear, that with acting and campaigning on fossil finance, we are enacting international solidarity, but also domestic. And the last point, the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine has, arguably triggered this current cost of living crisis due to our over-reliance within the UK and wider Europe on Russian oil and gas. And there's been lots of calls to increase our UK domestic supply of fossil fuels to kind of counter that, which makes a lot of sense. If you're the right-wing media presenting that argument. I think recently I saw a figure that the UK government is proposing to put £800 million behind the new Rosebank oil and gas field in the North Sea. That is £800 million that could be put into the welfare state, into our NHS, into resolving the cost of living crisis and making sure that distribution within the UK and also our international efforts, are better felt. But instead, that's money that the UK government, alongside banks, investors and insurers, are putting into the Rosebank field, which is going to further the climate crisis, further all of these things. So I think that there's an important link that we all need to make there, in terms of making sure that when we're talking about new domestic, within the UK, new domestic oil and gas supply, that's actually going to make issues like the cost of living crisis, as well as the climate crisis, worse. And globally and within the UK, all of these big fossil finance corporations are leading us to socioeconomic and ecological disaster. As I say, they're completely entwined. And I think what we have to do right now, as trade unionists, as climate activists, as both, is really make these links more visible than ever. And that means showing up at every strike around us. It means showing up on picket lines. It means speaking as climate justice activists, but also as trade unionists. We're not separate. These things have to be the same. I hope that these links made a bit of sense, but I'm super happy to kind of chat through some more of this now and hear some more of your thoughts on how we can kind of merge these things a little bit more. Clara, can I pass back over to you before my voice completely gives out?
Thank you so much, Al, for this link. yeah, I think like we were planning originally to break out into 3 smaller groups to focus on some of the related themes that we've talked about. So I'm going to give you the choice if you prefer to stay in the bigger group to have the discussion all together and raise some of these points, or we can also break into smaller groups. And we were going to have 3 themes. So one about continuing to talk about the cost of living crisis and the link with those fossil finance. One to talk about pension divestment and how we can maybe like renew because the campaigning and the trade union movement around pension divestments. And one looking at how we can organize more actions around bank and insurers. So maybe if people are up for the breakout rooms that I've just mentioned, do you mind to raise your hand now? And if you prefer to stay in one big group, then don't raise your hand. So I'll just give you a moment to do so. I hope people know how to raise hands, by the way. You go onto your menu at the bottom of your screen, and you can use the reaction button, and here you raise your hands. I can see no raised hands. Okay, so in that case, we're gonna all stay together and we're gonna open it up to any questions or any thoughts that you've got following the presentation, but also about like any idea about as trade unions, what else can we do, what our next steps are. Just wondering if anybody would like to start. And also, if you can use your hand to come in, that would be useful.
I think Ken had a hand up there, a physical hand.
I couldn't see. Ken, will you like to start then?
Yes. When we're in the branch meeting, we need to relate these demands to the business of our own union and our own branch, and we need to see how does it work together, so it's not a separate demand. It's part of our trade union work, our education work, our organizing work, and what we want to the branch to achieve.